Excellent. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me turn on my microphone so that you can all hear me. There. Is that a little bit better? Excellent. Okay. Thank you once again for having me for my final presentation of this conference. It's been absolutely wonderful to be here to meet everybody. Some people I still haven't talked to personally, but we'll get around to that. The topic of my talk today is Ireland and the slave trade. Now, I've checked with the organizers. I'm recording this on my own computer as we speak, so this will be available on my blog in the next couple of days. So if you want to see it again, you can see the slides with my voiceover in the next couple of days. You can also download a PDF version of the slides from my blog at DNA and Family Tree Research, one word, .blogspot.com, or just write that down, search for my name, and you will find it. This is a topic that I became interested in because my Spear and family research led me back to the 1600s. And there was a big question whether my Spearans came over to Ireland with Cromwell, which some members of the family were not very happy about, or whether they were fighting for the king and country, which they were more happy about, or shall we say less unhappy about. That's how I got into this area of research. And I was quite surprised to find that Cromwell had allegedly sent a lot of men, women, and children from Ireland as slaves to Barbados. And I'd never heard of this before, so that's what got me interested in this. I have a disclaimer, I am no historian. This is just my own personal learnings from my exploration of this topic. There's a lot of people here probably who know a lot more about it than I do. But what I would like to share with you at least is some of the things that I've learned. And certainly it is the start of some further research that I'll be doing, and some further research that hopefully the whole community will be doing. Now, what is happening here? What is this?
Oh, Steve McQueen, you're winning his Best Picture for 12 Years a Slave.
Lupita Nyong'o from Kenya, and we have Steve McQueen, who is British, and we have Benedict Cumberbatch, whose ancestors owned slaves in the Caribbean. So we have come a long way in the last 500 years, shall we say. What was the comment that Steve McQueen made that was quite shocking at the Golden Globes? He said there were 21 million slaves in the world today. Okay. And that was picked up by the media, so the BBC said, are there really 21 million slaves worldwide? It was also picked up by, and it coincided with the fact that 14 Caribbean nations are suing the British government for the damage that slavery did. So slavery is still very, very much a topical topic. It's still in the world today, and the 21 million comes from the International Labour Organization. The 21 million slaves today are not slaves for life, they're more forced labor, so people that are indebted to somebody else and are forced to work on their behalf. This is an index of the number of slaves in the world today. And the leading country with slaves are India, China, Pakistan, and Nigeria. The most slaves per head of population are in Mauritania, in West Africa, and in Haiti. Here's Mauritania here. Does anyone know when Mauritania abolished slavery? 1987. No, 1981. When was it illegal to own a slave in Mauritania? Excuse me. Sorry, let's get rid of that. 2007. So it's still a very, very topical thing today, and slavery is very much with us. In Ireland today, there are 160 slaves. So you can go to this website and you go through each country and you can find out how many people are working under conditions of forced labor. Now, what is slavery? Well, here is a definition from Wikipedia. There is chattel slavery, which was typically what was suffered by African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans, where the slave was the property of the owner. There is bonded slavery, such as indentured servitude, and we'll look at that. And then there's forced labor, which is non-indentured servitude. We'll also look at that. And it may be children who are kidnapped, spirited away, press-ganged, people who were shanghaied. There's also transported felons and convicts, such as when the English transported so many people to Australia. And then there's political and military prisoners who were forced to work as forced labour. And then the fourth category is forced marriage, which is not something that we're going to cover today. So the bottom underlying motivation behind slavery is the acquisition of a cheap labour force. And that is the main reason behind it. Now, Ireland is no stranger to slaves and slavery. St. Patrick was a slave. He was captured from Britain by some pirates. He was brought over. He worked as a shepherd in Ireland for 7 years, and then he escaped, went back over to Britain, thanked God for saving him, and God told him, go back to Ireland. So, cruel fate. We also had the Vikings, of course, and they were a very unruly lot. Here they are arriving on the ship, full of Guinness, of course. And, they had a thriving slave trade in Ireland, and in fact Dublin was the centre of the northeastern European slave trade back in the 1800s to about 1,000 or so. And the wealth of Dublin was largely based on the fact that there was a huge Viking slave market in that city. So the topic of today's conversation is really about the transatlantic slave trade. And during this slave trade, 12.5 million Africans left Africa, only 10.5 million Africans arrived, about 5 million went to South America, 5 million went to the Caribbean, and only about 400,000 arrived in the United States. So the population from which today's African Americans spring is relatively small, 400,000, compared to the population of Africans that went to the Caribbean and the population of Africans that went to South America. Interesting. The other thing to remember is that a lot of Africans who ended up in the Caribbean, their ancestors may have come into North America. So the source of entry to the United States for your ancestors may very well have been through the Caribbean. And that's both for the African ones and the European ones. Something to remember. Now, this is taken from African DNA, Professor Henry Louis Gates' website, and it just shows you, very interestingly, the proportion of people coming from the different African nations, both for the Afro-Caribbean side and the African-American side. So the 400,000 that arrived in North America were largely from Senegambia with 23%, and Angola with 23%. And then we have Nigeria with 16, Ghana with 11, Sierra Leone with 11. And that differs slightly from the Caribbean population. So it's worthwhile checking out these maps and also checking out the Slave Voyages website on the previous website. So on the previous page, rather. It gives you a lot of very, very useful and interesting information. Now, apologies for slavery were made by France in 2001, which recognized slavery as a crime against humanity. Benin, in West Africa, apologized for the central role Africans played in the Atlantic slave trade. Ghana apologized, Jerry Rawlings, the president there. The UK, in 2006, expressed a public statement of sorrow and a formal apology in 2007. And then individual cities in the UK have apologized, such as Liverpool, London. Then we have Virginia in 2007, resolving to profoundly regret and apologize for its role in the institution of slavery, House of Representatives in 2008, the US Senate in 2009, and Colonel Gaddafi in Libya in 2010. So there have been quite an array of apologies all around the world. This is Joe Mozingo. He spoke here last year. He gave a fascinating talk about how he was able to trace the Mozingo name, and I'm going to turn off this so it doesn't bother us again. Turn off the Wi-Fi. There we go. And then turn this on. And we're back in action. Yes. So Joe gave a fascinating talk last year about how he went in search of his Mozingo name. And he was able to trace it back to an African man who was probably one of the first Africans to arrive in the Jamestown area. And he was also then able to trace it back to West Africa, I think it was Cameroon, that type of area. And he gives a fascinating story about his search. And it kind of reminds us that 4% of white Americans actually have African DNA. And it varies between about 0.5% of their DNA to about 0.75% of their DNA. And that is exemplified by the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. A lot of their sons were able to pass for white, and I think over the course of time, a lot of people have passed for white and ended up in the general kind of European American ethnic grouping. So that was Joe's story. But while this was happening in the 1620s, what was happening in Ireland? There were a number of English colonizations of Ireland starting in 1556 and continuing up into the 1600s. And in many ways, Ireland and the colonization of Ireland was an experiment and a prelude for the colonization of America. So the lessons that the English learned in Ireland, they applied to the colonization of America. And that's quite important because a lot of the initial slaves were collected as a result of the Catholic Rebellion in 1641. So the first half of my presentation is more about the origins and focuses on white involuntary servitude, and then we go in and talk about African slavery later on. But if you see here, there were a lot of alleged atrocities committed, driving men, women, and children by hundreds upon bridges and casting them into rivers, who drowned not were killed with poles and shot with muskets. So when these kind of atrocities were heard of by the Protestants, that the Catholics were committing atrocities on the Protestants, Cromwell came in and he said enough is enough. He conquered the whole island. He had a scorched-to-earth policy, and at the end of that time, according to O'Hart, and this is a rather sensationalistic quote, women and children were found daily perishing in ditches, starved. The bodies of many wandering orphans whose fathers had embarked for Spain and whose mothers had died of famine were preyed upon by wolves. In the years 1652 and 1653, the plague and famine had swept away whole countries, that a man might travel 20 or 30 miles and not see a living creature. Man, beast, and bird were all dead or had quit those desolate places. So you really get an impression that the whole landscape was devastated. And against that backdrop, between 1652 and 1659, and it's just slightly off the screen there, somewhere, because the men had been rounded up, all the men who had been fighting, they were exiled. They didn't want soldiers in the colonies because they might create trouble. But all the women who were abandoned and the children that were left behind were herded down to Cork, across to Bristol, and then made the transatlantic voyages to the West Indies, which at that stage included Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas. So depending who you read, it was a few thousand, or it was 50,000, or it was 130,000, or it was an absolutely impossible 600,000. The population of Ireland fell from 1.5 million in 1649 to 900,000 in 1660, a drop of 40% in a 20-year period. If the number of people that were sent as slaves or involuntary servants over to the West Indies was 50,000, then that's about 4% of the population, which is really quite a big whack. Now, they would have met up with indentured servants who were already in Barbados from the 1620s. So you would have had a situation where indentured servants whose period of indentureship had finished would have seen these Irish slaves coming in. But what is not clear is whether these slaves had a time limit on their slavery or whether they were slaves for life. So again, further research needs to be done in this regard. Now we've talked about indentured servitude. This is what an indenture looks like. And this was a very, very common way of apprenticing people to a trade, but it was also a way of people getting their money back for transporting people over to the New World and then giving them lodgings and pay for a certain period of time. So the contract was this: you come over to work on my plantation for 4 years, that will cover the cost of the transportation and the lodgings. And a typical indenture, such as this one, reads as follows. This indenture, made the 4th day of August 1755, between William Buckland of Bayford and Thomas Mason of London, witnesseth that the said William Buckland shall and will, as a faithful covenant servant, well and truly serve the said Thomas Mason in the plantation of Virginia, beyond the seas, for the space of 4 years, in the employment of a carpenter and joiner. And then it goes on to say that he is of 22 years old, that he has no covenant or contracted servant to any other person, that he will get meat, drink, washing, and lodging, and his salary will be the rate of £20 sterling per annum, payable quarterly. So that's what a contract, that's what an indenture actually looks like. So any of your relatives that came over to the US as indentured servants, this is the kind of indenture that you might actually find for them. Now, indentures continued way up until the 1900s, and they were made illegal in 1917. But this is one from Cork in 1890, and this relates to apprenticeships. And I like this because it says that the term is 4 years, but if you start reading here, the actual criteria are that during the term, the said apprentice, his said master faithfully shall serve, his secrets keep, and his lawful commands every day where gladly do. He shall do no damage to his said master, nor see it to be done of others, but that he, to his power, shall let or forthwith give warning to his master of the same. He shall not waste the goods of his master, nor give nor lend them unlawfully to any. He shall not commit fornication, nor contract matrimony within said term. Hurt to his master he shall not do, cause, or procure to be done by others. He shall not play at cards, dice, tables, or any other unlawful games, whereby his said master may have loss with his own or other goods during said term. Without license of his said master he shall not buy nor sell. He shall not haunt nor use taverns, alehouses, or playhouses, nor absent himself from his master's service day or night unlawfully, but in all things be an honest and faithful apprentice. So it's very interesting to read the terms that the apprentices were supposed to live under, and you may find that your ancestors signed one of these indentures. So they only became illegal in 1917. The virtual Jamestown website has a list of all the indentured servants that came from Ireland. If you actually search for Ireland, and I've searched for Dublin specifically, these are records between 1718 and 1759. You can see that there are 22 people that came from Dublin. Here are their names here, and if you click on any of these, you get further information. Here's a variety of occupations, including bookkeeper and surgeon. So they had surgeons as indentured servants. The destination varied from Jamaica to Maryland to Pennsylvania. And this is the date of the indentureship here. It has the gender, it has the agent's name, the place of origin, and the agent's occupation as well. So do check out the virtual Jamestown website. It has some very, very useful information there. In terms of other non-indentured servitude, we have transported felons, and we also have this very interesting book that came out last year, Without Indentures, by Richard Hayes Phillips, and we'll be looking a little bit. We'll be looking at that in a couple of slides' time. So that is those two books there. The early 1600s were marked by kidnapping, and it was sanctioned by the states. So that in 1607 and 1608, there were ships sent to the East Indies carrying youths to do labor. And this is probably explained by a letter of 1618 from King James I to the East India Company, basically saying, "Get all the beggars off my streets." He said, "Whereas our court hath of late been troubled by idle young people having no employment, we have thought fit to have you send them away to Virginia, that they may be set to work there, wherein you shall do a deed of charity by employing them who otherwise will never be reclaimed from the idle life of vagabonds." So you can get an idea of the pomp and circumstance behind this. And he's up in Buckingham Palace or wherever, and the begging streets in a very Dickensian style are on the streets of London, and we need to rid the streets of these beggars. In Virginia, in 1643, a law was passed establishing the terms of servitude for servants brought into the colony without indentures. So if you were more than 20 years old, you had to serve 4 years. If you were between the age of 12 and 20, you had to serve 5 years. And if you were under the age of 12, you had to serve 7 years of non-indentured servitude. In 1654, a similar law was passed in Maryland. Also in 1655, the Virginia law was amended, and I love this, because the Irish were to serve longer than the English. If you were greater than 16, you served 6 years. If you were less than 6 years, 16, you served until the age of 24. However, in 1662, it was extended to the English, so they only had 7 years of reprieve, if you like. Then in 1659, the English law authorizes kidnapping. It may be lawful for 2 or more justices of the peace within any country, city or town, corporate, belonging to this Commonwealth to, from time to time, by warrant, cause to be apprehended, seized on, and detained all and every person or persons that shall be found begging and vagrant in any town, parish, or place, to be conveyed into the port of London or onto any other port, from where such person or persons may be shipped into any foreign colony or plantation. So this was basically state-sponsored kidnapping into slavery. And this kind of explains the mentality of the English and why they needed a cheap labor force, and that kind of led naturally to the slavery of African people. A lot of this is also on a wonderful website called British History Online. You can see that this applied to Irish children as well. Thomas Swainley Master to pass to New England and Virginia, where they intend to carry 400 Irish children, directing a warrant to be granted provided security is given to sail to Ireland, and within 2 months to take in 400 Irish children and transport them to these plantations. And similarly, in October 1655, 1,000 Irish girls and the like number of youths of 14 years or under to be sent to Jamaica. So there's a lot of correspondence there that clearly identifies the intention to take up vagabond children and transport them to the West Indies. And another letter from Henry Cromwell to the Secretary Thurlow: I shall not need to repeat anything, or actually start up here. I have little to add to what I've written in my last, therein giving you a full account of what we were capable to do in answer to your proposal about sending a supply of men out of our disbanded soldiers to Jamaica. So a lot of disbanded soldiers ended up going to the West Indies as well, but also I shall not repeat anything about the girls, not doubting, but to answer your expectations to the full in that. And I think it might be of like advantage to your affairs there and ours here if you should think fit to send 1,500 or 2,000 young boys of 12 or 14 years of age to the place aforementioned, Jamaica. So again, in the correspondence, you find a lot of intention to transport the children out there. Now, we still have to find the records of what slaves actually were sent out there or what children were sent out there into slavery. But in this particular slide here, which is from the book that I showed you, White Children Without Indentures, here you see the year, and here you see the number of children appearing before the courts in Virginia and Maryland. And the peak year was around about 1699. So the turn of the century, there were 677 white children brought before the court. If you compare the equivalent figures for Negro and Indian children, you'll find that there's very, very few in the early 1600s, a little bit more in the 1680s, and it's only towards the end of the century and the first part of the 1700s that you start seeing African people, African children appearing in these courts. The same for the Native American Indians or the First Nation people. Their children appeared very scantily in the records throughout that time, really. And just to show you the next one, the ages that were adjudged by the court varied from 1 year old up to about 27, and the average age was about 14 or 15. Now, you might say, well, there's a big difference between the European children and the African and Native Indian children. the African and native Indian children were slaves for life. The European children had a period of indentureship, which was then terminated. But the reason why the African and native Indian children were brought before the courts was because slaves were taxable. And they were just brought before the court to ascertain their age and then get an idea of when their owners could start being taxed for them. So that's why the African and Native American Indian children were brought before the courts. You'll see that 90% of children in the 1600s were white. In the first decade of the 1700s, 45 were white and 52 were African. And in the second decade of the 1700s, less than 33% were white and about 2/3 were African. So there's a real change in the ethnicity of the children coming before the courts. The reason why the book is only about the European children is because the African children, the native children, only had first names, and therefore it was of limited use for genealogical purposes, which is why the book was written. The author of the book was actually able to trace his own ancestor back to one of these children. Now, this is what the actual book looks like. And you'll see that there's a Brennan here, there's a Carroll here, there's a Cunningham, a Donoghue, a Fitzgerald, a Kelly. So there's very, very clear evidence here of Irish names among this list, indicating that some Irish children did reach the West Indies and were actually served as unindentured servants for a number of years. The other thing to note is that occasionally, and just to show you first of all, you get the surname, the first name, the date they arrived, the date they were in court, their age adjudged by the court, and the owner of the unindentured child, unindentured servant. You occasionally get additional information such as the name of the ship, the captain of the ship, the date of arrival, or the port of departure. And Irish ports recorded in these court record books include Belfast, Derry, and Dublin. So you may this is a large book, you may actually find evidence here of one of your ancestors in this index. It's largely just an index of names, which from each county and each county courthouse in Richmond and Virginia and Maryland. The Irish origin may not be obvious because they changed the names to English surnames, number one, and because any ship that left Ireland had to travel to England first in order for it to be lawful for that ship to sail to the new colonies. So just keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that the 13th Amendment of the Constitution included involuntary servitude as well as slavery, and that probably is related to the fact that there were so many unindentured servants coming over during this period as well. Now, were the Irish ever slaves for life? I don't know. I suspect that some of them were. I suspect that if there are records of this, it's probably in the Caribbean, but that we know that slaves for life did not really have their names recorded in records, so it may be very, very difficult to actually find out if this is true or not. But there are three books that are interesting to read. The first one by O'Callaghan, To Hell or Barbados, is a very engaging story written by a journalist who didn't reference his sources. So if anybody wants a task, go back and edit the book and include the sources and an index at the end, and that would be really, really good. So we do need sources, and going back to primary sources would be very, very helpful. He actually went out to Barbados. He was in his 70s when he went out to Barbados to do this work, and he apparently looked at all the Barbados records. He traveled to Jamaica as well. It's a shame he didn't record where he found the information he found, but the work that myself and Cynthia Wells are doing on this at the moment, Cynthia says that a lot of the things he refers to, she's actually finding the original source for. So that'll be part of our ongoing endeavours. White Cargo by Jordan and Walsh is another very good one. And Nini Rogers is a retired professor of history in Northern Ireland, and she's written a very good book called Ireland, Slavery and Anti-Slavery. This is extensively referenced, so do have a look at that as well. This is taken from a church in Kildare, and it says, "Pray for all who rest here or who prayed in this holy place, including Conor Byrne, Teach Moran, James Beacon, and Turlough Dunn, who on the 20th of November 1655 were sentenced to death also the following, who on the 27th of November 1655 were sentenced to transportation to the Barbados. So this, and there's 5 priests among them. So two soldiers were killed, and as punishment, all of these people were sent out to the Barbados as involuntary servants. Now, whether they were slaves for life, or they died there, or they were released, we don't actually know. But that is on a church in Kildare. Now, the Redlegs of Barbados are a group of people who are thought to be the descendants of either Irish or Scotch servants or slaves that were actually sent out to Barbados in the 1600s. They've largely kept to themselves. They are a very poor group. There's a lot of endogamous, there's a lot of inbreeding, there's a lot of congenital malformations, a lot of diabetes. They are supposed to be the remains of these Irish slaves that went out to Barbados way back when. Rihanna's father is a Redleg. So it would be very interesting to do a genetic study to see just exactly what the genetic signature of these people is, and to what extent you still find a Scottish or Irish signature there. Now, turning to the transatlantic slave trade itself, 3% of it occurred during the years of 1450 to 1600, 16% during the 1600s. The 1700s was the peak year with 52.5%, but even during the 1800s, we still see a huge amount of slavery, because remember, the abolition of the slave trade was 1807. So we're still saying 28.5% of all slaves coming over from Africa in the first 7 years of the 1800s, which is absolutely incredible. Irish involvement in the slave trade, the Irish occupied all the social roles associated with the slave trade. They were slave traders, they were slave merchants, they were overseers on plantations, they were slave owners, they were merchants supplying goods for the plantations in the West Indies. Cork, Limerick, Belfast, and Dublin thrived because of the trade in salted and pickled provisions, preserved food that could be sent out to the West Indies for the slaves and for their owners. The Irish were both abolitionists and anti-abolitionists. Daniel O'Connell was one of the most fervent abolitionists, and he achieved Catholic emancipation in 1829, and partly because of his efforts, in 1833, we achieved the abolition of slavery in the UK. In 1838, Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery, and in 1845, he published a book about his experiences, The Narrative of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Following the book's publication, he received death threats. There was a fear of him being kidnapped by his old owner, and so he was encouraged to go on a trip. Where did he go? He went to Ireland. He arrived in 1845. He met Daniel O'Connell, and there were some very, very moving words from his biography of that time. And it says, 11 days and a half gone, and I have crossed 3,000 miles of the perilous deep. Instead of a democratic government, I am under a monarchical government. Instead of the bright blue sky of America, I am covered with the soft grey fog of the Emerald Isle. I breathe, and lo, the chapel slave becomes a man. I gaze around in vain for one who will question my equal humanity, claim me as his slave, or offer me an insult. I employ a cab. I am seated beside white people. I reach the hotel. I enter the same door. I am shown into the same parlor. I dine at the same table, and no one is offended. I find myself regarded and treated at every turn with the kindness and deference paid to white people. When I go to church, I am met by no upturned nose and no scornful lip to tell me we don't allow niggers in here. So he had a very, very positive experience in Ireland. And a couple of years ago, his descendants came back and gave a very moving speech in Glasnevin Cemetery, thanking the Irish people for treating their ancestor as a man. He was not the first slave to come to Ireland. Olaudah Equiano did a tour in 1791, spoke at many public meetings, and writing to one of the abolitionists in Britain, he says, "Sir, I went to Ireland and was there 8.5 months and sold 1,900 copies of my narrative. It was actually more popular than Moll Flanders." Which tells you something about the impact that these tours were having on the Irish population and on the British population as well. His 4th edition was printed in Dublin, And also in 1841 there was a tour by Charles Lennox Redmond, who was another escaped slave. On the other hand, we have this person here, John Mitchell, who was very much in favour of slavery. He was a radical nationalist and a leading member of the Young Ireland movement, and for that he is praised and held in very, very high regard. He was charged with treason in 1848, spent prison in Bermuda and Tasmania, wrote the jail journal there, but escaped in 1853, became an editor in New York and Tennessee. He had two sons who died in the Civil War on the Confederate side. He equated the Confederacy with Ireland, but he was explicitly racist and an ardent supporter of slavery. He said Africans were an innately inferior people, slavery was inherently moral, and he wanted to make the people of America proud and fond of slavery as a national institution, and he advocated its extension by reopening the trade. So it's really quite unusual when you hear this, because Mitchell is just remembered for being a staunch nationalist, and nobody really talks about his racist beliefs. As well as the tours that many former slaves made in Ireland, the slavery was a topic in the papers. Here's one from 1807 reporting the Slave Trade Abolition Bill has been passed in both Houses of Parliament in Britain. Then, of course, we had in Britain the abolition of slavery, which was in 1833, and we also had the reporting in 1865, the abolition of slavery in the US. It's reported here in the Freeman's Journal, aptly named, from Dublin. But there were also in the 1700s a couple of advertisements in Irish papers to be sold for account of DF, a black Negro boy aged about 14 years, remarkably free from vice and a very handy willing servant, from the Cork Journal, 1762. And that's one of two such ads that appeared in the Irish newspapers. Hart, in 2002, estimated that the African population of Ireland in 1750 to 1800 was somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 African people. So it wasn't unusual to see African people in Ireland at this time, probably in the larger cities rather than in the rural areas. Now, the Irish were slavers. William Ronan, he was a Catholic Irishman, served with the Royal Africa Corps between 1687 and 97. He was chairman of the Committee of Merchants at Cape Castle in Ghana. So the Irish were moving up and down the coast of Africa as slavers. Antoine Walsh is quite infamous because during his time, 1700 to 1763, he bought about 12,000 slaves and was responsible for supplying them to Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue, which later became Haiti. Etienne and Laurent O'Riordan in Nantes, that's O'Riordan, an Irish name, they were from Derryvoe, County Cork, but they led 11 expeditions in the 1700s and bought 3,000 slaves. And similarly, the Roach family, who had Limerick roots, they bought about 3,000 slaves as well. So the Irish were involved in transporting slaves from Africa to the West Indies. They were also ship owners, merchants, and sailors. So, for example, ship owners based in Bristol in the 1760s included Michael Callahan, John Teague, John Coughlin, James Connor, all very Irish names. Slave merchants in Liverpool in the 1780s included Felix Doran, Christopher Butler, Thomas Ryan, James McGauley, and David Toohey from Tralee, who did 4 slave voyages. He was the part owner of 10 slave ships, and he described himself as being in the African trade for many years, in which I've made a pretty fortune. There were also a lot of Irish sailors. 12% of slave ship sailors were Irish. The English were the largest nationality, with 75% of sailors being English, and the Scots had a smattering at 9.5%, but the Irish were the second most frequently encountered ethnic group among the sailors. Probably one of the most famous drawings is of the Brooks slave ship, and you remember seeing this, probably very, very tightly packed people in the hold. This was a diagram produced in 1789 by the abolitionists, and it was designed to really wake up people and make them realize how inhumane these slave ships were. But in 1776, the captain was Irish, and his name was Clement Noble, and he was from Ardmore. And during one of his voyages, he was confronted by an enemy privateer near Barbados. He armed 50 of his cargo and successfully repelled the attack. Commenting that the Negroes fought with exceeding spirit, he sailed on to Jamaica, where he sold them on the north coast of Montego Bay. So extremely callous, and this just goes to show the chattel nature. These people were property, viewed as property. Another pretty disturbing one is John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. He started off as a slaver. He had 3 voyages from Liverpool to West Africa, and there were some Irish crew members among his crew with names like Caron, Megan, Gallagher, Shaughnessy, and Cooney. Now, Cooney wasn't a very nice guy. Cooney took a female slave and lay with her brute-like in view of the whole quarterdeck, for which I put him in irons. I hope this has been the first affair of the kind on board, and I am determined to keep them quiet if possible. If anything happens to the woman, I will impute it to him, for she was big with child. Her number is 83. So Cooney basically raped this African woman in full view of everybody on the ship. Now, the Irish and the Africans have mixed over the course of time, and there's several reasons for this. First of all, they were side by side on the social ladder. So the Africans were probably on the lowest rung, the Irish were frequently on the next rung up, and for that reason they lived in close proximity. There was interbreeding, there was even intermarriage. There was also the breeding policy that happened especially in America, less so in the Caribbean, and the sexual exploitation of women, which resulted in white men fathering, having sex with African women, frequently because the Irish were often overseers on the plantation, but also because the Irish tended less to be absentee owners. So they would have been more prevalent than, say, the English or the Scots, quite frequently. So these were 2 reasons for why you might find Irish genes in African Americans today. The other possibility for why a lot of African Americans or Afro-Caribbeans might have Irish names was the custom of naming the slaves after the owner of the plantation. So it doesn't necessarily imply a genetic transmission, it could be just transmission of the surname, because that was the name of the plantation owner's surname. We have Eddie Murphy. Apparently his grandfather or his great-grandfather was Irish. We have Muhammad Ali, whose great-grandfather was Irish, and he came back to Clare a couple of years ago in 2009, charmed the pants off everybody there, and was given the freedom of the city, so he was given a huge welcome. Because, of course, we have Barack Obama, who came back and met his ancestors or his relatives in Moneygall, but we also have Michelle Obama, whose ancestors were traced back to an Ulster slave owner, and her 2 times great-grandmother was sexually exploited by a man called Charles Shields, who was the son of the plantation owner, and they came from Ulster. So you get a whole array of different things. Muhammad Ali's great-grandfather married a freed African woman sometime in the 1860s, I believe it was. So that was after the abolition of slavery. This is a great website. This is full of genealogical information. Because what happened was, in 1833, the UK abolishes slavery, and it pays £20 million in compensation to the slave owners for the 800,000 slaves that they have lost. £20 million in that day and age was 40% of the GDP. 40% of the gross domestic product went in 1 year to the slave owners. Now, when you're talking about that amount of money, you're going to make a note of it. And this database has all of that information. But interestingly, the slaves were not freed, per se. They were actually said, okay, you're free, but now we're going to give you an indentureship as an apprenticeship for the next 4 to 6 years. So the slaves had still to keep on working for 4 to 6 years as apprentices. And that labour alone was probably worth another £10 million. And so the people that actually paid the compensation were the taxpayers in Britain. The slave owners themselves paid very, very little and lost very, very little, because they were practically 100% compensated for the loss of the slaves. Of the 45,000 claims in this database, 40% of them are from women. And that's because they were either the widows of previous slave owners or they were slave owners themselves. So it's very interesting that 40% of these claims are actually from women. 3,000 of these claims were absentees. So that's 7% of all of the slave owners in this database were absentees. And absentees owned 50% of the slaves and received 50% of the payments. So 7% of the slave owners received 50% of the compensation. The largest claim was for £83,530, 8 shillings and 11 pence, and it was made to James Blair in Newry, County Antrim. He was Irish. And that was compensation for his 1,598 slaves. Because this database is so comprehensive, there's been a paper written about Ireland and slave owners at the time of emancipation. So this is 1833. This is the compensation that's paid out to absentee Irish slave owners. And what it finds is that both in Ireland and within the Irish diaspora in London, Liverpool, and Glasgow are striking instances of slave owners whose legacies helped shape Ireland's commercial, cultural, and physical fabric in the early 19th century. So Ireland benefited hugely from the slave trade. There were 3 types of Irish slave owner. There was an absentee owner in Ireland, there was an absentee Irish slave owner in Britain, and there was Irish slave owners living in the colonies themselves. Many Irish owners were very small scale, probably because the Irish never had the same kind of economic clout as the English to go over and spend lots of money on buying slaves and really benefiting from the opportunity that slavery offered to them. So a lot of the reason why the Irish were small-scale owners is because of the lack of economic opportunity that the Irish had, rather than that they were any less bad as slave owners than the British. There were fewer absentees in Ireland compared with England and Scotland. In Ireland, there were 13 absentee slave owners per million population. In Scotland, there were 107 absentee slave owners per million population, and the rest of the UK, there were 165 slave owners per million population. Many Irish absentees went to England, largely because at that time, before 1829 certainly, the slave owners would not be allowed to practice Catholicism in Ireland, so they went to England instead, where there was less restriction on the expression of their religion. But because there were so few absentees of Irish compared to English, there might actually be a greater Irish genetic imprint in the West Indies. So that's something that cries out for attention and research. Here is a table that actually shows the awards identified with absentees in Ireland by colony. And most of the absentees were in Jamaica. Some were in British Guyana, which is now Guyana, Trinidad, Antigua. There were a couple in Tobago, and there were a few in Barbados as well. So that gives you an idea of where these absentee landlords were mainly based, and Jamaica was the top hit there. The slave owners in Montserrat with Irish names included 7 people named Irish. There were 8 people called Blake, 6 people called Daly, and they were mainly small scale, owning less than 20 slaves each. The beauty of this database is that you can go to each of the Caribbean islands in turn and you can explore the slave owners on that particular island. And you can see how many were Irish, Scottish, English, and so on. Now, if you click on any of these names, you get a wonderful array of information. 105 of the 45,000 records are for absentee Irish slave owners. There's a Kelly, a Thomas Kelly, a Margaret Kennedy, a Nicholas Kerwin, all very, very Irish names. For example, James Kelly lived at Newton House, Abbey-Knockmoy, County Galway. He had 101 enslaved people on Jamaica, St. Anne, Crescent Park, They were worth £2,054. Then he had 215 enslaved people in Jamaica in the area of St. Thomas in the east, and they were worth £4,086. You can see here that there were 46 enslaved in Jamaica. Here was 1 enslaved in Dominica, and here were 225 enslaved in Antigua, and it gives you the amount of compensation as well as the address of the slave owner in Ireland at that time. And you'll get the same kind of information for England, Scotland, Wales as well, because this covers the whole of Britain in 1833. Now, many of the slaves and slave owners abandoned the West Indies and made it into America that way. So when you're doing your research, do remember that your ancestors may have actually come through the Caribbean. And here's a website called Caribbean Immigration that has some information about the influx into the US. And just to read here this quote from Richard Dunn, between 1678 and 1713, leeward sugar planters became more rich and powerful and controlled all local councils and assemblies. So white servants and small farmers abandoned the Leeward Islands. And many of them headed into Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, and they probably took their slaves with them as well. So your ancestors may have come in through the Caribbean. Family Search have a very good summary of the records available when we're talking specifically about African American slavery. And if you just do a search for slavery, it comes up with 293 hits. So that's a very good starting place for any exploration of the American side of things. In Ireland, the National Library of Ireland has a number of interesting results as well. Things like the pedigree of Curwen of Galway and Martinique, the Black Irish, documents relating to the Irish in the West Indies. So this is a very, very useful resource for your Caribbean research. Also, the National Archives in the UK have a very, very comprehensive section of their website dedicated to looking for records of slavery or slave owners in their particular British archive. And there's a variety of other places where you might want to look to find information about Britain and Ireland and the involvement in slavery. On Ancestry, we have the slave registers of former British colonial dependencies between 1812 and 1834. We have Guy Grenham's book, Tracing Your Caribbean Ancestors, which is very, very helpful. He is a native of Barbados. We have the Caribbean GenWeb project. We have a group called the Caribbean Ancestral Research Association in London. And the BBC has a very useful website that looks at researching African Caribbean family history in general. I should also mention that the database that I showed you with all the slave owners from 1833, this is part 1 of the project. Part 2, they'll actually start looking at the slaves themselves. So expect by 2015 an expansion of this database to include details of the actual slaves themselves. So that will be a very exciting development. I'm going to finish off by talking about Montserrat, where I was last year, just after St. Patrick's Day. Now, Montserrat is a little island in the Caribbean. You can see it here. It is about 27 miles southwest of Antigua. And there you see Antigua there. And this is an aerial view of Montserrat. This is the volcano that exploded in 2003. Here is the capital city, Plymouth. All this gray stuff here is pyroclastic flow. The capital city was wiped out and is now under about 20 feet of lava. With that wipeout, you lost not only your capital city, but you lost the livelihoods of everybody in that city, as a result of which there has been an 80% diaspora from the island. 80% of the island's population has emigrated to either other islands in the Caribbean, to the US, or to the UK. It is still a British dependency. The population of native Montserratians is now 2,500. The reason why Montserrat is so special and relevant to this talk is because it is the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean. 100,000 welcomes and shamrocks greet you as you arrive on Montserrat. You have Erin and her harp on the national flag of Montserrat. You have names like Tuet, who was a major slaveholder on Montserrat, still present today. There's a bottle of Guinness up on the side of the store. You have Rhymes, there's Jackie Rhyme. Here we have Fogarty Hill, spelt wrong. And here we have James Alfred Sweeney, who in one of the graveyards. So there's loads of Irish surnames there. If you go on a walk through the island, which has no crime, there's no crime on the island, and that's what has attracted a lot of people. Another 2,500 of the population are expat, US and UK, European. So, and they pride themselves, and they're very, very friendly. You know, walking on the road, everybody waves to you as they drive past in the car. So you wave back. You get tired after a while. But it's really great. On one of my walks, I like to go walking, it says Fáilte, which is the Gaelic for welcome. And this is an Irish design around one of the houses. Here is the Irish flag. So here is an Irish bar in Montserrat. Irish flag with the volcano in the background with the clouds around the summit. Now, I said that they celebrate St. Patrick's Day for an entire week. The reason why they celebrate St. Patrick's Day is because that was when the slaves rebelled against the Irish plantation owners. Okay? They got together and they thought to themselves, right, we're going to have a rebellion. When's the best time that we'll get them drunk? St. Patrick's Day. So that was the reason why they celebrate St. Patrick's Day. It's actually partly because we're Irish and partly because we rebelled against the Irish. So it's a very interesting, the two sit quite interestingly together in a kind of an uncomfortable way. Professor Howard Fergus says that he will never wear green on St. Patrick's Day because of the history of what the Irish did to the African population. But the general feel is you're Irish, you're welcome. One person said to me, I think we're more proud of our Irish ancestry than our African ancestry, which I found a very, very strange comment. But in Montserrat, the first Irish arrived in 1632. They were Catholic refugees who had been refused by Virginia, so they went back into the Caribbean. The Irish in Antigua were about 25%. In Nevis, they were about 25%. But look at the number of Irish here. 769 men, 410 women, 690 children, and 1,800 total. The number of blacks, 400, 300, 292, and a total of 992. So this was very, very much an Irish colony, which inspired people like Donald Harmon Atkinson to write the book, If the Irish Ran the World. He concluded that they'd be no better than British slave owners, English slave owners, Scottish slave owners, etc. Professor Howard Fergus, one of the island's top academics, wrote a history of Montserrat. These are some very, very useful and interesting books if you want to see what impact the Irish had on this particular island. Where are the Irish today? Well, in Montserrat, you've got a whole range of Irish names. We've seen some of them already, like the Ryans, the Chewits, the Sweeneys. Barbados has got O'Brien, O'Connor, O'Dell, O'Donnell, O'Dowd, O'Grady, O'Hara, O'Keefe, O'Neill. Jamaica has loads of Irish names as well. And what I've done is I've set up a website which is still at a very, very rudimentary stage of development, so please forgive its rather crude look. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to gather everything into one place and try to stimulate research into the Irish in the Caribbean and the Irish impact on slavery. I've put together the phone books of all of the islands in the Caribbean. So if you want to see if any of your ancestors are on a particular island, you just click on the links on this particular page and it'll take you to the phone book, the white pages for that particular island, and you can search and see if there is anybody there with your particular ancestral surname of interest. How about DNA testing? Well, the average DNA test for the average African American reveals Sub-Saharan African about 65 to 80%, European 19 to 29%, and Native American about 0.6 to 2%. So there is clearly a lot of admixture in African Americans. It appears to be a little bit less in the Afro-Caribbean population, because I'm working with a group called Jamaica Family Roots in Birmingham. We've started doing DNA testing, and the kind of percentages we're getting are 20% European, 15% European, 80% African, or 85% African. So maybe there was less breeding going on in the Caribbean colonies compared to America. But it's still at the early stages of research, and this is an area of research that is crying out for attention. The other thing that is worth noting, Professor Henry Louis Gates is a perfect example. If an African-American person does their Y DNA, as in Professor Gates' case, in 35% of cases it will end in a European haplotype, a European genetic signature, and Professor Henry Louis Gates' father's line goes back to Nile of the Nine Hostages, which is again a very, very Irish haplotype. And similarly, his mother's line on his mitochondrial DNA goes back to a European woman. He has spoken with Professor Dan Bradley in Trinity College Dublin, and they've come to the conclusion it was probably an Irish indentured servant. But 10% of African Americans will have European a woman on their mother's line. And of course, Professor Gates has done this excellent series about finding our roots, which combines traditional and genetic genealogy, and he also is a frequent contributor to The Root, which is a wonderful website and a great resource for further research and for giving you a really clear idea of the circumstances around slavery. So the future, certainly for me, will be to try and get more people interested in doing Irish Caribbean research. This is why I started the ICARA website. Now, I'm currently trying to get in touch, well, I've got in touch with the government of Montserrat, and I've got in touch with National Geographic. So what I'm trying to do is to get a free DNA project up in Montserrat so we can see what the genetic imprint of the Irish is there. So I'm hoping that over the course of the next several years that we'll be able to get that kicked off and just get more people in the Caribbean interested in DNA testing. And that will allow reconnection, reunion with Irish cousins living in the homeland today, and a recovery of a history and a culture and a heritage that we really haven't given very much attention to over the course of the last several decades. So now with the centenaries of the next couple of years in Ireland, such as the 1922 and the founding of the Irish Free State, this is a perfect time for the revision of Irish history, and hopefully DNA will play a part in that. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, any particular questions? We probably have a few moments. Yes, one question down here.
I saw that one of the last slides, Cuba mentioned, I'm curious if that was part of the whole, on the same scale as some of the other islands like Montserrat, was there a whole lot of Irish enslaved things going on in Cuba as well?
In Cuba?
Yeah.
I'm not specifically aware of Cuba. I know that a lot of Irish, when they were kicked out by Cromwell, the men were kicked out, and we don't want your soldiers in our colonies. He basically said, you can go to any country in Europe that is not at war with England. You are exiled, never come back. So a lot of them went to Poland, a lot of them went to, I'm not sure if they went to Spain, but some of them ended up in Spain. And of course the Spanish came over to Cuba and the Caribbean, and you find a lot of O'Neills in Puerto Rico. So there's a lot of O'Neills in Puerto Rico. Any other questions?
I was just going to make a comment about your book. It was Sean Callahan.
Yep.
Is he still alive?
He died before it was published.
Oh, because I was going to say, a lot of times journalists, if you contact the author, they will provide their resources to you.
Yeah, no, he sadly died before he died, before it was published. So one of the things I'm hoping to do is that somebody will actually take O'Callahan's book, which is already written, and then go back and just find out where the sources are. So that's another little task for the next decade or so. Hours of happiness, years of happiness. Great.
So why did they allow men to take their families and go?
They basically were interested in just getting rid of the men, and it's like divide and conquer. You know, why would they send the wives with the men? Just banish the men to any country not at war with England. I thought it was easier for technical and logistical reasons to just get rid of the men. And then leaving the women destitute, they were a source of cheap labor. Also, you'll find in some of those writings that women were needed in the Caribbean. And the Irish women were, and according to O'Callaghan, the Irish women were regarded as rather cold and frigid sexually. So the Irish women were allegedly abused when they went to the Caribbean. It's not too difficult to imagine that that would be the case. But there was a benefit for just sending the women over without the men. Any other questions? Another one here?
Do you know the source of the term Black Irish?
Very interesting question. I think it's used mainly in America, heard not very often in Ireland. And if you read the internet, which is a terribly dangerous thing to do when you're talking about this type of topic, there are so many inaccuracies, so many urban myths, that you have to take everything you read on the internet with a pinch of salt when you're talking about this particular topic. But the Black Irish, some people think it's to do with an African association. More people might think it's to do with the Spanish Armada being shipwrecked off the coast of Ireland in 1588. And all these Spanish sailors came ashore and said, look how handsome I am. And that's how the Black Irish won the hearts of the Irish women. And that's how the Black Irish happened. That's rubbish as well, because the Irish clubbed the Spanish sailors to death on the beaches in an early form of Board Fáilte, which is the Irish Tourism Board. Welcome to Ireland. Any other questions? No. Well, listen, thank you very, very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Something I thought about just now. There is a guy, he's a rapper named Q-Tip
Oh, right, yeah.
from the Tribe Called Quest. His dad is from Montserrat,
Really?
and his mother's African American.
Q-Tip is from his dad's
He's
from
from
Montserrat.
His dad's from Montserrat. So if you maybe want a little celebrity whistle, someone
Yes.
in the United States, probably reach out to him. I don't think like African ancestry or anybody's tested him yet.
Right,
So
okay.
He would be an interesting case to kind of
No,
check
definitely,
out.
definitely. Yeah, I'd love to get Rihanna as well.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, that is definitely in my mind. The more celebrities we can get testing, the better.
The better.
But I think there's so many NPEs, as you can well imagine, in the Caribbean, that it is, as the French say, they banned DNA testing. The French banned DNA testing to preserve the peace of the family. So there's probably been a few French presidents who have been less than integral, or having less than integrity. Their wives probably have been put to one side. So I imagine the same kind of situation is going to be very, very prevalent in the Caribbean. Guy Granum, who's from Barbados, says it's going to be impossible to do a genetic study in terms of finding your genealogy and matching your genetic family tree to your genealogical family tree, because he reckoned about 60% of children in Barbados were born out of wedlock during that historical time period. I don't know if it still happens today, but there is a lot of baby fathers and baby mothers and all that kind of stuff. So a project like the National Geographic Project might be better, where you just say, we're only looking at the general population, ancestral, ethnic admixture, and just to get a picture. But we're not actually predicting whether or not you're an NP. Yeah, so. Cool, thanks, Nika.
In yesterday's talk, you mentioned a book that everybody who's doing Irish history.
Oh yeah, that's right.
What was it?
It's called Tracing Your Irish Ancestors.
Absolutely, okay. And it was by,
John Gresham.
oh, okay. Because
It's on sale here as well.
I didn't see it here.
Yeah, it's inside.
Yeah, I can see it. Because I looked last night and all I was looking at, I knew it was tracing your Irish history, but then I was like, I got several other ones.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure.
Decided to make so many years ago, Mary and my family research that I might find a young